Well, a new friction point in the Russia-NATO confrontation seems to be emerging. The United States is readying more than $2 billion worth of military aid for Ukraine. The new package is expected to include longer-range rockets for the first time, and Russia is livid. Moscow says these weapons would escalate the conflict but not change its course. Kiev is asking its military backers for modern fighter jets and missiles with greater range. Long-range missiles will allow Ukraine to push ahead with plans to retake all of its territory by force, including annexed Crimea. So far, Ukraine's allies have said no. There are concerns that the long-range missiles could be used to target strikes. Could be used to strike targets deep inside Russia, further escalating the conflict. NATO does not want a direct conflict with Russia, and there is now a strong buzz that Washington is planning to give Ukraine missiles with a range of up to 150 kilometers. So what has changed now? When the war began last year, the West was clear that it would not arm Ukrainian troops with offensive weapons. Tanks, long-range rockets, they were all out of question. But as the war dragged on, the West changed its stance. In January this year, NATO countries made a U-turn and decided to send tanks to Ukraine. Kiev is now urging the West to send fighter jets. Zelensky's shopping list is expansive. Will long-range rockets be the next wish to be fulfilled? Moscow says any U.S. long-range rocket supplies won't deter the Russian military. Now President Biden says he will discuss Ukraine's latest request for advanced weaponry with President Zelensky. There is still a studied silence on Zelensky's demand, though, for F-16 fighter jets. Ukraine and the West have accused Russia of waging an illegal war to design and expand its territory. Moscow says the objective is to demilitarize Ukraine and protect Russian-speaking communities. For more on this, we're now joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis, who's a military expert for defense priorities. Thanks very much for speaking to WION. Now, why do you think Ukraine needs these long-range weapons? How are these likely to actually help Kiev in this war against Russia?
When Ukraine got the HIMARS system 5 or 6 months ago, that changed the dynamics a lot because it allowed Ukraine to strike at a medium range distance, which was hitting the Russian ammo supplies at command and control nodes, rallying points, etc., behind the lines, which impacted their ability to come forward. Russia then basically figured out where those lines are and as far as they could, and they moved all those things behind it, which really mitigated the use of the HIMARS in terms of their daily operational use. With these longer range weapons, it'll almost double the range, and then bring those things into range for the Ukraine side. So that's what they want to do, to continue making it more difficult for Russia to conduct the close fight by impacting how far they have to move back their supplies into the rear. But the bigger issue, especially for Russia, without question, because this is what Peskov has mentioned earlier today, is the fact that it will bring all of Crimea into range. And that is one of the big problems and potential red lines for Russia. It's different than anything has been up to this point. And so Peskov is saying that Russia will respond accordingly. And, we don't know what that means. But it does raise the risk of potential escalation, which I think is something that's not in anybody's advantage in NATO and something we have to be careful with. Now, I will point out, though, it's important to note that according to reports this morning, that these are not going to be coming, these long-range rockets won't be coming from existing U.S. stocks, but will have to be built. So you're talking probably into 2024 at the earliest before those things can actually show up on the ground.
Interesting. So while these may not be immediately available, you certainly believe this could lead to a significant escalation, and the fact that annexed Crimea could be within the range of these weapons is something that is going to be a matter of huge concern for Russia. But let me ask you this. The U.S. had earlier said repeatedly that it would not provide offensive weapons to Ukraine. But after tanks and long-range weapons are being provided now, what do you think has led to this change? Is it the fact that the war has dragged on much longer than most had expected it to?
Well, it's a combination of that and also the fact that at the beginning, there was lots of uncertainty about where the genuine red lines were, aside from the rhetoric. There was concern that if we went too far, then that could cause Russia to think, okay, this is now a direct fight with NATO and we're going to expand it into NATO. And they were afraid of expanding, that Russia would expand the war into that. But so they went a little bit here, and then they went with the HIMARS and then with the M109 Paladins, and then finally with the Abrams and the Martyrs, and then all kinds of other vehicles, and the Patriots. That was another early big red line. And all of those things have been done, and at least up to this point, Moscow has not taken any action directly against NATO. The problem that poses for us is that it could create the belief in the West that there are no red lines and that we can literally do anything. And the problem with red lines is that only one side gets to decide where they really are, and that's Putin. And, the risk that we run is that one day we cross what is a red line and that he does expand it. And that could come in the form, which they have said in recent weeks, it could be that they're going to attack the hosting places and places where they unload this stuff, even if it's in like Poland or in Slovakia or some other NATO country. If it's weapons that are destined to come into Ukraine to fight Russians, they consider that a fair target. They haven't done that yet, but if that does, then we have a whole new problem with potential Article 5 provisions.
Okay. It's very interesting. Talking of red lines, I want to dwell a little bit on that. This war is now in its 12th month. Moscow has repeatedly said the West must not cross the red line. And it also says that the West is escalating the war by increasingly arming Ukraine. The question here is, are Putin's red lines constantly shifting here, you think? Is NATO trying to call his bluff in a sense? How do you see these mind games that are playing out?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a very dynamic situation. I would even go so far as to suggest that Putin wasn't sure where his red lines really were, even for himself. But one thing he has to always calculate is what is the expected response. So I'm sure he wants to do things. I'm sure they would love to attack the positions within Poland and these other places where the staging areas for all this are, because if they can destroy that before it ever gets into Ukraine, then that's less potential attacks on his troops in the field. But the problem is what is the West's response? If he crosses that red line, do they have a new line of his that they crossed? Do they start directly attacking Russian forces? Because as bad as it is for Russia right now, and at least as much as it's kind of a close fight, if it turns into a NATO versus Russia fight and 30-on-1, then there's no way that Russia could survive that conventionally, which would almost certainly force them into using tactical nuclear weapons. And of course, everybody knows that once you start using that, then the other side has a response. And that's what is so far preventing Putin from taking any big actions. But again, the problem is that if he gets desperate, if he feels like he's running out of time or he doesn't have the resources to wither this fight on the conventional level, he may do that. And that's just unknown to anybody, and maybe not even to Putin up to this point.
Well, it certainly would not be in anyone's interest, and I think that is the million-dollar question. Is it only a matter of time before it actually turns into a Russia versus NATO war? And as many have warned, that could very well be the beginning of World War III, something that nobody wants or can afford. On that note, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis, thank you. A pleasure, as always, talking to you.